All right, Rabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, Baruch Meir and Rinda Dubin for dedicating all the Shur and Joshos this month in the Schus of Refuah Shlima for their niece Chavet Zipora Bas Chaya Malka. To thank Shmuley and Liba Dinovitz for dedicating the Shurim this month in the Schus of an Aliyah for the neshama of Shmuley's father, Harav Peretz Avram Ben Arav Binyamin Moshe. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Ira and Miriam Grossman, in honor of their 50th wedding anniversary, and Adam and Leslie Rosen in the Schus of Refuah Shlima for Esther Bas Sora. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Chol Yisrael. All of the neshamas should have an aliyah, and the families a nechama. With that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. A really, really incredible daf. Today's daf is Kuf Vav 106. We are picking up on 105b Kuf Hey Amud Beis. We're picking up 11 lines up from before the lines get wide. So it's not, I'm embarrassed to say the number of lines up from the bottom. Right, so 11 lines up from where the lines get wide. So we'll say, remember again, we left off in the middle of a pretty dramatic story of a bit of a showdown between Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi, and Avdon. Right, Rabbi Yossi was late, not late, but because he was very heavy, it took him some time to get into Shir. Rabbi Shir and Rabbi Yossi, and Avdon gave him some significant, and as we're kind of going to see, some unwarranted musr. So the Gemara then goes on to the story. The Gemara says as follows: Adahachi Asya Yevama lekamei de Rebbe. All right, so while they were having this exchange, a Yevama came before Rebbe. A woman came in. Amarli Rebbe la'Avdon Puk Badka. So Rebbe said to Avdon, look, go take her, and someone has to examine her, because at the end of the day, what they have to see is she a Gedola or is she a Kitana, right? What age is she? In other words, and is she subject to Yibum? Lebasar dinafak, after Avdon left, Amar Rabbi Shmuel said, Kach Amar Abba, this is what my father Rabbi Yossi said, Ish Kasaba Parsha. The Torah, when speaking about Yibum, only makes reference to an Ish, meaning that the man in question has to be an adult. Aval Isha ben Gidola ben Kitana. But the woman in question, right, could be a Gidola or a Kitana. Amar Leisa, Rebbe says, ta lo tzariches kvar hora zaken. Rebbe said to Avdon, stop, no examination is necessary, because the Zaken Rabbi Yossi has already paskined that a woman, even if she is a minor, or girl, even if she is a minor, is subject to chalitza. So the Gemara says, kamifsa Avdon va'asi. So I will say, so at this point in time, remember, all of this is happening, just to give you the context, all of this is happening while the Talmidim, the students, are seated in Shir. Remember again, why did Avdon get upset at Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi? Why did he get upset? Because he said, why are you trampling on the heads of the Talmidim? Because everyone's seated on the floor. Rabbi Shmuel Yossi is walking in. Again, I'm not calling him late. He wasn't late. It was just taking him time to get to his seat. So it looked like he was walking on the top. So now the roles are reversed. Now, Avdon is the one who left and is coming back. Rabbi Shmuel Yossi says to him, Amrlei, I'm sorry, Kamifsa Avdon va'asi. Amrlei Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi, Mishet lo am kadosh, yifsa al rashi am kadosh. He who is needed by the holy nation could trample or could walk upon the heads of the holy nation. Mishe'in sarich lo am kadosh. Whoever is not needed by the holy nation, yifsa al rashi am kadosh. How is he permitted to go ahead and walk on the heads of the holy people? So Rabbi Yossi gives back Mosra to Avdon because he felt very mistreated, and rightfully so, by Avdon. And he says to Avdon, listen, only those who are absolutely necessary for the Am have the ability to take certain liberties with the kavod of the Am. But those who are not absolutely necessary for the Am can't take liberties. Rabbi Yossi telling Avdon, you don't really have a right to walk in and look like you're walking on top of people. Or the truth is, I will say, what he's really saying to Avdon is what? You can't trample on people. You can't trample on people. And of course, a reference again to the fact that Avdon really trampled unnecessarily on the feelings and on the cover of Rabbi Yossi. Amrli Rebbe la'Avdon, kum b'duchtech. Rebbe said to Avdon, stay where you are. Rabbi Yosef, remember again in yesterday's daf we saw that the Gemara held Rebbe accountable for not intervening in this exchange. Here, Rebbe intervenes. And Rebbe says to Avdon, stay where you are. In other words, essentially siding with Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yossi and telling Avdon, you can't walk into the base medrash now. Ta'ana, ba'osa shah, so we'll say Avdon was punished for his treatment of Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yossi. And what happened to him? Ta'ana ba'osa shah nitztara Avdon. Listen to this. Avdon got saras. Tavu shnei banov, his two sons drowned. Mianu shtei kalosav, his two daughters-in-law did miyun. So Rabbi say pretty significant punishment. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Baruch Rachmana de Kaspe la Avdon b'Ha'ama. Amo. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, Baruch Hashem, that Avdon was punished for his transgression in this world. In this world. So Rabbi say, so that's the end of the story. Rabbi say, but again, a lot to say on this story also, but really quite a dramatic thing about how careful we have to be with how we treat one another. In other words, at the end of the day, what did Avdon do? Avdon disrespected a Talmid Chacham. That's what he did. And again, in Avdon's defense, I don't think it was meant in a malicious way. In Avdon's defense, he thought that Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yossi was really acting inappropriately. So he took him to task for it. But you see how careful we have to be in how we treat one another, in how we deal with the dignity of one another. It's amazing. I'm Rabbi Ami. So I'll say, jumping back to halacha for just a moment. I'm Rabbi Ami. B'drav shel Rabbi nilmad. We'll say from the words of Rabbi Yossi, we can learn the following: Ketana choletzes b'puatos. A ketana could do chalitza when she reaches the age of puatos. I will say, what's the age of puatos? So Rashi points out over here, this is the age when a minor is recognized that their transaction is binding. So I will say it's interesting. Usually the Rashi points out the age of 7 or 8, where if a minor engages in a transaction, we assume that there's enough das to make the transaction binding. Rava Amar onas nidarim. Rava says that a girl could do chalitza once she gets to the age of nidarim. What's the age of nidarim? A year before bas mitzvah. Rabbi say, what's the halacha of hilchasa? Ad shetavi shtei saros. I will say the halacha is like, as we saw in the Mishnah, namely, she has to have reached physical maturity. So I will say the way we paskin halacha l'maisa is that just as a man has to be a gadol in order to be able to go out and do chalitza, so too a woman must be an adult. So she must have reached the age of 12 years old in one day, showed signs of physical maturation. If she's any younger than that, then as the Mishnah taught us, that chalitza would be invalid, and you would have to do chalitza again when she reaches the age of adulthood. That's how you pass halacha l'maisa. Next, cholza b'shnayim. So remember again, we saw in the Braisa, our Mishnah said you need a beis din, right? You need 3 people for chalitza. We saw a Braisa that quoted 2 opinions who held that chalitza is even valid with 2. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yossi bar Minyumi, Amar Rav Nachman, ein halacha ka'osa zog. The halacha does not follow that pair of rabbinic sages who said all you need are 2 witnesses. We paskin that halacha l'maisa you need not witnesses, in 2 people. We paskin you need 3. V'am Rav Nachman chadazimna, dam Rav Nachman bar Minyumi, Am Rav Nachman chalitza b'shlosha. We already learned this. Rav Nachman already said that chalitza requires 3 people. So why do you have to say 2? Why do you have to say both of these statements, right? Why do you have to say chalitza requires 3 people and the halacha does not follow that pair of rabbis? It's the same thing. To which the Gemara will tell you why. Tzrichi, di itmarhach kamaisa havamina hanimi lechatchila aval di eved afilu trei kamash malan ein halacha ka'osa zog. Because we'll say, had it just said that you have to do chalitza with 3, like Rav Nachman said, chalitza b'shlosha, I might have thought that's what? That's lechatchila. Lechatchila you should do chalitza in front of 3 people, but b'di'eved, if you only did it in front of 2 people, what should be the halacha? It's valid. Therefore, again, we come along and we say, Ein halacha ka'osa zog. The halacha does not follow this particular pair of rabbis, and therefore, even b'di eved, you cannot do chalitza with 2. Ein halacha ka'osa zog. And if you would have said, just simply the halacha doesn't follow that pair, ele kitana kama hava mina di eved aval lechatchila liboy chamisha. Wow, I will say, I might have thought like this. If you would have just said the halacha doesn't follow this pair, who says you can do chalitza in front of 2, I would have thought maybe halacha l'maisa lechatchila, you should require 5, like we saw earlier in this sugya. Kamashmala, no, we pass like Rav Nachman, that chalitza follows and requires 3. So the Rav says, so far again, started off the morning with 2 strong pieces of halacha l'maisa. Number one, that ultimately you can only do chalitza with a woman once she becomes a gedola. That's number 1. Number 2, we've reinforced the halacha that chalitza requires a beis din of 3. Beis din of 3, that's even true bidi eved. We also see a strong piece of hashkafa l'maisa, that we have to be careful how we treat the feelings and the dignity of another. Good. Maisa shechalzu. We both say this is fascinating. So remember again, the Mishnah had this story. The Mishnah had this story of Maisa shechalzu, right? There was this episode where they did chalitza with 2, right? What was the lashon of the Mishnah? Lashon of the Mishnah was Maisa be'echad shechalatz beino lebeina bebeis ha'asurim. There was a story of a man and a woman who did chalitza in jail. Uba Maisa from Rabbi Akiva v'hechsher. The Maisa came before Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva declared it a valid chalitza. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. If they're doing chalitza in jail, beino lebeina miyadana, we'll say if the chalitza is occurring in jail, and assuming all there is a man and a woman there, who's able to testify, right? In other words, what independent corroboration is there that chalitza occurred? The cases where witnesses saw the chalitza occurring outside. Witnesses saw the chalitza. Ibailu, okay, so we'll say Ibailu. Now we'll say, obviously, this is a little anticlimactic for us, right? Because we just established in the previous sugya that what do you need for a chalitza? What do you need? Beis din of 3. Okay, so we know this is not going to work halacha l'maisa, but it's intriguing nevertheless. Ibailu, Maisa shechalzu beina lebeina avroi, uba Maisa fnei Rabbi Akiva bebeis hasurim. Odilma Maisa shechalzu beino lebeina bebeis hasurim. Shabbos say, here's fascinating. What's the case? Is the case of a man and woman who did chalitza outside in the world, and they didn't know what the status was, so they brought the case to Rabbi Akiva, and it was Rabbi Akiva who was in jail. Remember again, Rabbi Akiva was incarcerated by the Romans. He dies in captivity. So at the end of the day, who's in jail? Is it Rabbi Akiva who's in, or is the Maisa of Chalitza took place in the free world? And the Shaila was brought to Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva was in jail, or did the Chalitza occur in jail? Amar Yehuda Amarav, the Beis Ha'asurin Haya Maisa, or the Beis Ha'asurin Ba Maisa. They both say, to which Rabbi Yehuda responds, name of Rav, both. The Maisa occurred in jail, and the Shaila was brought to Rabbi Akiva in jail. Incredible. Rabbi say, if you take a quick look at Tosas, the last Tosas on the Daf, Uba Maisa to Rabbi Akiva Beis Ha'asurim V'im Tomar, Fab Masnisa Mash Rabbi Hedja Shechalza Beis Ha'asurim, Diktani Maisa Shechalza Beino Lebeina Beis Ha'asurim, Uba Maisa to Rabbi Akiva Yishlomar, Tebeharbe Sfarim Gar Sinon, Ba Maisa to Rabbi Akiva below Vav. The Kainai Beis Ha'asurim are Rabbi Akiva. So again, Tosas is pointing out over here different girsos, but the girsa that the Gemara clearly had was that the event, the Maisa, occurred in jail, and the Shaila was brought before Rabbi Akiva in jail. Vim Tomar, Heich vehechi pashet shamaisa balafnei Rabbi Akiva Beis Ha'asurim. V'lo bav Rabbi Shlomar diodeh hagimar shebalafan of Beis Ha'asurim kidarim b'Yerushalmi. Rabbi Yochanan say this is incredible. Tosas goes to Yerushalmi. Last 2 lines of Tosas. Rabbi Yochanan Hassandler avar kumei chavushin Rabbi Akiva. Hayamachriz v'amar man by machtin umay by tzanurin. Chaltza beinola beina mahu. Rabbi say the Yerushalmi tells the full story that Rabbi Yochanan Hassandler used to come before Rabbi Akiva's cell in jail. Now he used to come and he used to ask Rabbi Akiva shailos, halachic questions, but you couldn't say it straight out, right? Because if you say it straight out, again, Rabbi Akiva could get into even more trouble. So he used to go ahead and ask these veiled questions. Who requires needles? Who requires spindles? Chaltza beinola beina mahu. What if he did chalitza, just a man and woman together? In other words, so he would kind of begin a mundane conversation with Rabbi Akiva, and then in the middle, or at the end, throw in there a halachic shaila. So the shaila would go unnoticed. And Rabbi said this was the dialogue that Rabbi Yochanan would have with Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi said the episode of the Mishnah is an episode which occurred in jail, man and woman in jail, brought before Rabbi Akiva for a psak halacha in jail. Rabbi say top of Kuf Vav. Tan Rabbanon. Chalitza mutas. Rabbi say this is a fascinating case. A mistake in chalitza. right? A mistaken chalitza, or more appropriately, a chalitza undertaken under mistaken pretenses, is a kasher chalitza. Kasher chalitza says, we'll say, top line, Kuf Vav Amud Aleph. Eizui chalitza mutas. By the way, what's an example of a mistaken chalitza? Listen to this. Amreish Lakish Kol She'omrim Lo Chalutz Ubekach Ata Konsa. Very simple. They will say, you're going to see, when are you going to have a situation of a chalitza mutas? They will say, it's very simple. We're going to have a situation of a recalcitrant yavam. Right? This is going to be the mice of the case. I need the brother-in-law to do yibum. The brother-in-law doesn't want to do yibum. We'll say, why doesn't the brother-in-law want to do yibum? Why doesn't he want to do, chalitza. I need the brother-in-law to do chalitza. Right? Why doesn't he want to do chalitza? So it could be for a variety of reasons, right? Maybe he really wants to marry her. Let's be down the kafschos. That's possible. It could also be because what does he want? What does he want? Money, right? We're going to see. So, but let's go with the idea that he really is bent on marrying her, right? So now he's bent on marrying her. We know as a Beis Din, this marriage is not a good idea, right? Why isn't it a good idea? For a variety of reasons. Maybe he's 80 and she's 20, right? Usually not the recipe for success, right? So, right, or maybe he's just not a good guy, right? And therefore, we as the Beis Din know that this is not a good idea for a marriage. But he is bent on marrying her. How can we get him to do chalitza? So maybe I will say what we do is we fool him and we tell him, listen, oh, you want to do yibum? No problem. This is the process for yibum. She's going to remove your shoe. She's going to spit. You're both going to say a couple of psukim, and then we'll break the glass. Mazel tov. So the Gemara says, that can't work. I'm Rabbi Yochanan, ani shona, both say 4 lines down on the top, Kuvav Medalef, ani shona, Benshin is kavin, hu v'lon is kavnehi, whether she had kavana, he had kavana, she didn't have kavana, or niskavnehi, v'lon is kavin, or she had kavana, he didn't have kavana, chalitza sapsula, ad she is kavdu shtem ke'echad. And I both say, we've already established, what does chalitza require? What does it require? Kavana. And who has to have kavana? Both parties. So if he thinks that he's marrying her by doing chalitza, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. Va'at amrit chalitza sekshera. So we'll say, here's what we have. Just listen to what we have. We have a statement. What's the statement? Chalitza mutas. A mistaken chalitza is kosher. So we're trying to figure out what? What does it mean, a mistaken chalitza? So what it can't mean is that he thinks he's marrying her through this mechanism, but in fact, that can't be. That can't be. So Ella, the boss say this is incredible. Ella, kol she'omrim lo, chalutz lo, al menas shetiti lach masayim zuz. Oh, they will say, what's the case of a mistaken chalitza? The boss say this is a bit more like it. In other words, that what happens? He's willing to do chalitza. What is he willing to do chalitza for? Right, for what? For money. Sivan, you want money? Here's the deal. Here, do chalitza with her on the condition that she's going to give you 200 zuz. I both say, so what does he do? He does the chalitza. And now what? She refuses to pay him. She refuses to pay him. Even though she refuses to pay him, ultimately, the chalitza is a valid chalitza. It works. So the Gemara says, that supports this, and obviously we'll see why this isn't just a moment. Chalitza mutas kshera. A mistaken chalitza is kasha. Ezo hi chalitza mutas. What's a mistaken chalitza? Ultimately, again, both say where she promises him money for chalitza, he does the chalitza, and she refuses to pay. There was one story of a woman who fell for yibum before a man who it wasn't the right shidduch. It just wasn't a bezin, so it wasn't the right shidduch. And they said to him, do chalitza, we'll pay you 200 zuz. And sure enough, the episode came of Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia said it's a valid chalitza, and she doesn't have to pay him. So we'll say, essentially what we're saying is, a chalitza mutas, a mistaken chalitza, is a chalitza made with a t'nai, with a condition, but yet for some reason the condition is a non-binding one. Why is the condition a... Rabbi will say, think about it just a moment, right? So remember again, Rachel is married to Ruvain. Ruvain dies. Reuven has a brother, Shimon. Shimon's ready to do Yibum. Rachel doesn't want to do Yibum. She wants to do Chalitza, but Shimon is insistent on Yibum. So the only way to get Shimon to agree to chalitza is how? Promise him money. So she promises him money. I do chalitza on the condition I'll give you 200 zuz. He does the chalitza. Suddenly now the Gemara is saying she doesn't have to pay him. Which essentially means what? It's a non-binding condition. Why is this a non-binding condition? So we'll say it's actually quite fascinating. Take a look at the top Rashi on Kuf Vav Madalev. Top Rashi. Amarash titin loch masayim zuz. The afagav de lo yava. Even though she doesn't pay him, chalitza sekshera. The chalitza is still good. Why? Kedimefurish beksuvas ba'amadir. We'll say listen to this. It's incredibly important. Techol t'nai b'mnei gad b'mnei ruvein gaminon. T'nai she'ef shalahasos aydei shaliach. Supposed to listen to this. In general, when it comes to the halachos of a t'nai, where do we learn out the halachos of t'nai from? B'nei gad b'nei ruvein. Remember again, Moshe Rabbeinu is going to lead Klal Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael. B'nei gad b'nei ruvein say they want to settle the Transjordanian lands. They don't want to go in. So what does Moshe Rabbeinu do? He makes a t'nai, makes a condition with them. What was the condition? The condition was if you go in and you fight alongside your brothers for the rest of Eretz Yisrael, then once ultimately they conquer, divide up the land, you could go back and assume your possession of the Transjordanian lands. I will say, the halachos of Tanai of condition are modeled after that. And there are a number of halachos that come out of that Tanai. First of all, every Tanai has to be phrased, belav vehein, has to be phrased in the positive and the negative. Because Moshe says to Negab and Ruvain, if you go ahead and you go along and you fight alongside your brothers, you'll get the Transjordanian land. And he says, if you don't fight alongside your brothers, you will not get the Transjordanian. So we learn out every Tanai has to be phrased in the positive and negative. Another thing we learn out from Bnei Gad Bnei Ruvain, which is, we'll say a Tanai is only effective if it can be carried out or executed through an agent. Through an agent. I will say, where do we learn this from? Because Moshe Rabbeinu makes a Tanai with Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain. And I will say, who executes the Tanai? Who executes it? Yoshua. So you see from here that in order for a Tanai to be binding, it must be executable, that's a word, executable through an agent. I will say over here, when you make a Tanai regarding Chalitza, is it executable through an agent? And the answer is no, because no one other than the Yavam could go ahead and execute Chalitza. In other words, Rabbi say, the Yavam can't appoint a Shaliach to go ahead and perform Chalitza on his behalf. That doesn't work. So Rabbi say, this is incredible. So because you have a situation over here that is not, you can't delegate, you can't appoint a Shaliach, because you can't appoint a Shaliach, is incredible. Any T'nai that you make regarding Chalitza, ultimately again will be a non-binding T'nai. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, when she goes ahead, and so we'll say, so again, it's a technical detail. In order for a T'nai to be binding, and any T'nai, in order for it to work, has to resemble the T'nai of Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain. That's ultimately, again, Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain. And therefore, one of the details there is by Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain, the T'nai could be executed by a Shaliach. Therefore, in order for any T'nai to be binding, it has to be executable by a Shaliach. Chalitza cannot be executed by a Shaliach, therefore the T'nai is non-binding. They both say, what is the effect of a non-binding T'nai? What's the effect of a non-binding T'nai? Halachically, how do we view it? As if it doesn't exist. Therefore, when a woman says to her Yavam, do Chalitza with me and I'll give you 200 zuz, we view that T'nai as what? Simply not existing. So therefore, again, once the Yavam does Chalitza, Chalitza's done, and she is not on the hook for the 200 zuz. And we'll say incredible. That's why the Brisa says Chalitza mutas kshera. A Chalitza. That's why the Gemara is calling this a mistake in Chalitza. It's not really a mistake in Chalitza. It's a Chalitza with a non-binding T'nai. So Chalitza with a non-binding T'nai, the Chalitza is good. She doesn't have to pay. Says the Gemara, Huda asla kamed Rabbi Chia bar Abba. We'll say there was this situation that came up for Rabbi Chia bar Abba, same type of thing, where a woman promises to pay 200 zuz to the Yavam after he does Chalitza. Amar la biti amodi. So we'll say, here was the situation. Right? Man and woman come before Rabbi Chia for Chalitza. So he tells the woman, stand up. And I will say, when he tells her stand up, Rashi says, Amudi v'syab milo. Now I will say, Rabbi Chia thought that this was going to be a situation of Yibum. Right? So they're coming to Bezdin. The husband died, right? Reuven died. Rachel and Shimon show up in Bezdin. Rabbi Chia sees them. He says, okay, Rachel, do yibum. Do yibum. Amr le ima. So Rachel brought her mother to Beis Din. The mother says, Yeshivasa zohi amidasa. Her sitting is her standing, which was another way of saying, my daughter does not want to do yibum. The mother speaks, my daughter doesn't want to do yibum. Amr le yadatle. So Bechia says to the widow, do you know your brother-in-law? Amr le in. She says, yes. Mamonuhu de chazala, the kavala michle minei. There's only one reason my brother-in-law wants to marry me, and that's why? My money. My money. He wants my money, and he wants to go ahead and use my money. Amr la, lo nechalach. So Rabbi Chia says to her, tell me, you don't want to marry him? Amr le lo. She says, no, I don't want to marry him. Amr le, so at this point, Rabbi Chia turns to the Yavam, and he says, chalotz la ubekach atakonsa. So we both say, the Yavam, in this case, the Yavam is intent on marrying the Yevama. Now we know the sub-story over here. He wants her money. He's refusing to do chalitza. Rabbi Chia says, okay, Yavam, let her take off your shoe, and through that you will marry her. Labasra de chalatz, after she took off the shoe, Amrale, hashta minach ifsalala, chalutz la b'chalitza ma'al yase, kihechi di tishtari la'alma. Shabbos say, now remember again, this type of chalitza, where he thinks he's marrying her through this, obviously it doesn't work. It's not chalitza. But I will say, what have we seen? Anytime you do some behavioral part of the chalitza process, the chalitza ceremony, I will say, what does that do? It shuts the door to yibum. So I will say, this is fascinating. So what Rabbi Chia does is, he tricks the guy. He tricks the guy into letting the Yevama take off his shoe. Now again, so the Yavam thinks he's getting married. But once she takes off his shoe, I will say, what does that do? That closes the door to yibum. So he says to Yavam, sorry, now you can't marry her. Now it's true, proper chalitza has not been done, so she can't marry anyone else. But Lamaisa, Rabbi Chia says, now, once she can no longer marry you, do regular chalitza, so that she can marry to the general population. So Rabbi Chia tricked him. He tricked him. Now I will say, remember again, I want to be clear, tricking the brother-in-law does not affect chalitza. The only thing it does do is what? Closes the door on yibum. I will say, but this is an important Gemara, because what you see over here, is that the Rabbanim were actively intervening on behalf of the woman to prevent a yibum situation when she did not want to do yibum. Bas chamod Rapapa, naf lifnei yavam sheinu hagala. Supposed to listen to this. The daughter-in-law, right? The daughter-in-law of Rav Papa, or I should say the daughter of the sister of Rav Papa, fell before Yavam. That wasn't a good match. So we'll say another situation of where, remember again, Beis Din, we saw in the Mishnah, Beis Din gives the Yavam advice. Do marry her, don't marry her. So these are examples, these are stories of where Beis Din saw not a good idea for this couple to get married. So apparently the man still wanted to marry the woman. Beis Din saw this is not a good shidduch. So what happened? Beis Din says to the man, let her take off your shoe, and through taking off the shoe, you'll marry her. So Rabbi say, what about that? Rabbi Yochanan said, what should we do? So what should we do? Rabbi say, now remember again, Rabbi Yochanan says that Allah Lamaisa it's not proper chalitza until when? Until they both have kavana. So what are you accomplishing over here by tricking him into having him allow her to take off his shoe? To which the Gemara says, rather, the better thing to do is promise him money. Promise him money. Right? So they said to the Yavam, listen, this is not going to work out. So do chalitza, make some good money off of it. Let her do chalitza, and if you let her do chalitza, ultimately we'll pay you 200 zuz. Lebasar de chalatz, as after the woman took off the shoe, Amar zil havle. He said to her, go pay him. Now in this case over here, ultimately again, Abaye said to the woman, you should pay him. Amar lei, mishatani b'cha avdulei. So she says, no, I was just kidding around. Haha, right, good one, right? I promised you 200 zuz, but I didn't really mean it. Essentially what she was saying was, I made a non-binding agreement with you. First of all, you're not such a nice guy, right? I didn't want to marry you, right? So you shouldn't have done this to begin with. If I didn't want to marry you, you should have let me out with chalitza. You didn't want to let me out with chalitza. You thought you're going to exploit me. Joke's on you. Now I'm a chalutza. I don't have to marry you, and I'm not giving you anything. I was kidding around with you. So after all, boss, didn't we learn Milo Tanya? Boss, this is actually a fascinating case. Boss, let's say a person was running away from jail, right? Now, to be clear, he didn't do it, right? I want to be going to go on record. Obviously, right? He's innocent, right? He's innocent. He was taken advantage of, right? So he's running away from jail. We'll say, so what happened? We'll say, now here's what's amazing. He comes to a river, right? So there's a guy with a boat by the bank of the river. And what happens? Amrale told Dinar Vavirani, we'll say, imagine the following scenario, right? So what happens? The boat driver said, no, I'm not ferrying any passengers, right? Especially those in orange jumpsuits, right? I'm not ferrying anyone. So what happens? The escapee tells the boat driver, I'll pay you $1,000. Pay you $1,000. So we'll say, let's say normally the fare across the river is $50. He promises him an exorbitant amount of money. What's the halacha? Ein lo ela scharo. We'll say once the escapee gets to the other side of the river, the only thing he's on the hook for is what? Is the normal fare. So Rabbi say there is this concept in halacha when people commit themselves to exaggerated sums in times of duress. Halacha l'maaseh, the only thing they're really accountable for is what we'll call the normal wage, the normal amount. Because he could say, but you promised me $1,000, the boat driver could say, to which the escapee says, it was under duress. I was kidding around with you. I was on the run. I had to commit to anything to get me to the other side of the river. That's why I committed to you. So the Gemara says, "Hachanami mishatani b'cha." So too over here, the woman could say, "I was kidding around, right?" And Rabbi say, now here is even stronger, right? Why over here is strong? Because as we saw before, halacha l'maisa, really this type of tanai is a non-binding tanai. Because the only time that a tanai is binding is when that ultimately it can be executed through a shaliach. Here, chalitza cannot be executed through a shaliach. So this is really a non-binding tanai. Amrale avucha. So heicha amrale. So ultimately, so I will say, listen to this. So I will say, so this is a conversation ultimately again between Abaye and Rav Papa. So I will say, so remember, in this case, Abaye wanted her to pay. Rav Papa says, no, she doesn't have to pay. And Rav Papa goes through the whole reasoning. So I'll say it's a very strange end to the story. Amrle, avucha hecha. Sabai says to Rav Papa, tell me, where is your father? Right? Sabai says, well, where is your father? So ultimately, Amrle b'masa, my father's in the city. Imach hecha, where is your mother? Amrle b'masa, my mother's in the city. So Rav Papa responding, Yoivu einei v'shechivan. Abaye put his eyes against Rav Papa's parents and they died. Okay, what's happening? Rabbi say, take a look at Rashi. So avucha hecha, Amrle Abaye the Papa, avucha hecha, kilomar kimuduma ani sheish lecha av ve'em smuchim lecha l'sapek tarchech lefichach kamechadadon shmaitech. Rabbi says, listen to this. Abaye says to Rav Papa, you must have parents who are alive and supporting you, that you have the ability to learn without any financial worry. And that's why your learning, right, your teaching, your learning is so clear to you. And I want to be clear, Abaye was not upset at Rav Papa. Abaye was not upset, but he was saying to Rav Papa is, clearly the ability, you have such clarity, it must be that you have such incredible bracha in life that you have no financial worry. And I say, when you have no financial worry, you know the daf really well, right? You also, right? When there's no obligation to go to work, no obligation to run anywhere, you could chazer, you could this, you could that. So Abaye was just remarking. So what happened over here? As a result, essentially, of Ayin Hara, so Rav Papa's parents passed away. Let's talk about this in just a moment. What's Ayin Hara, right? So we see this a lot, Ayin Hara. I don't want to Ayin Hara. Say Ayin Hara is like this. When a person utilizes his brachos in life in a way which gives other people tsar, which gives other people pain, that's where HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, if you're using your brachos in a way which causes other people pain, I'm taking away your brachos. And I will say, now that's true even if I don't intentionally use my brachos in a way to cause other people tsar. See, I will say, when it comes to one's blessings, one has to be at sanua. One has to be modest, because I never know how my brachas cause other people tsar. I will say, Abai didn't have parents. So he sees Rav Papa, and Rav Papa has such clarity, and Rav Papa seems so calm, and Rav Papa doesn't seem to have a care in the world. And Rabbi says, wow, it's incredible. You must have parents who take care of you. You must have parents who support you. That's incredible. And it must be that bracha caused Abaye pain. And as a result of Rav Papa's bracha of parents caused Abaye pain, Abaye lost that bracha. I will say, it's just a din insensitivity as to how we use our bracha. So we'll say, this happens all the time. You hear people complain about things. Sometimes you don't realize that which you are complaining about is something that someone else doesn't have. I will say, how many times do you hear a person complain about carpool? I had to drive this carpool. I will say, you know how many people in this world would give anything to drive carpool? Now, I don't mean the act of driving carpool, but I mean having the schos to drive children to school, right? Or a person complaining about something about their spouse. How many people wouldn't yearn to have a bracha of a spouse, right? Or a person talks about, the market's down. Shkoyach, right? How many people wouldn't like to have a parnasa so that they could worry about where the market's holding or not? And again, I will say, these things are not said, they're not said, chas v'shalom, in an arrogant, bragging way. They're said because a person is making conversation. But sometimes the very thing that I'm talking about represents a bracha that the person who I'm talking to, as I was saying very often, you don't know. Again, you see someone, you don't know who has children, who doesn't have children, who's married, who's not married, right? Who goes ahead and has parnasa, who doesn't have parnasa. But a person has to be so careful about how they talk about their brachos in life. Because just in an unknowing way, by talking about something that you have, you could cause pain to someone else who doesn't have it. It's a heightened level. We'll say, by the way, you see this now the second time we've seen this today, how careful you have to be in your interactions with another to never cause another Jew pain. Incredible. We'll say, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, chalitza mutas kshera. As you just saw before, the Gemara is calling this a mistaken chalitza. But really, what does mistaken chalitza mean? A chalitza with a non-binding condition. Says the Gemara, get mut'ah pasal. Now, a get given under mistaken pretenses ultimately is going to be pasal. Chalitza mu'usis psula. A coerced chalitza is pasal. Get mu'usa kasher. But yet a coerced get is kasher. Okay, what's the case? Hey chidami. What's the case of coercion? Ida amarot sani. We'll say if it's a case of we're applying pressure, but at the end of the day he says, I want to do it, afilu chalitzinami. We'll say that type of coercion, even by chalitza, should work. In other words, we'll say, let's say we need the guy to do chalitza, and we beat him up until he says, you know what, I thought about it a little bit. And 4 black eyes and 2 broken ribs later, or maybe it's better, 2 black eyes and 4 broken ribs later, right? Lamais, I thought about it, and I decided, I really want to do chalitza. So we'll say, if that's the case, then it should work. V'i lo amarot sani. And if he doesn't say, I want to, get nami lo. Get shouldn't work either. Hakim Razuli means to say, I will say, chalitza mutasni olum kasher. I will say a mistaken chalitza, which we've identified to mean what? A chalitza given with a non-binding t'nai will be kasher. The get mut'a the olam pasal. But I will say mistaken get is no longer going to work. As I will say, if a man thinks something different is happening when he gives her a get, that does not work. Right? So a get given under mistaken pretenses will be pasal. Chalitza mu'usis v'get mu'usa zimnin kasher v'zimnin pasal. I will say, listen to this. But a chalitza done under coercion, or a get done under coercion, sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work. So the Gemara says, when does it work? Hada amarot sani, right? Hada lo amarot sani. See, I will say, if there's coercion, but the husband says, I don't want it, but he never says, I want to do it, then a coerced chalitza and a coerced get will not work. But Allah Chamais, if there's coercion, and he finally comes to the point where what? He says, I want to, then what? Then it'll work. then it'll work. So the Gemara says, "Desanya yakriv oso." I will say the pasuk says, talking about a carbon yakriv oso, he will bring it. Malamed shekofen oso. Will say means that by sacrificial law, you can force a person to go ahead and bring a carbon that he is obligated to do so. Yochel bar kolcho. You might have thought that he could even force him to do it against as well. Tamalamar lirt. So no, it has to be according to his will. So we'll say, how does that work? Yakriv also means we could coerce him to bring a carbon that he's obligated to do. But yet a carbon has to be according to his will. So how does that work? HaKetzad, Kofin oso ad shiyomer rotzani. We'll say, how does it work? How does it work? You force him until he says what? I want to. Force him until he says I want to. And we'll say, by the way, I'll just point out, just a moment. I know the guy doesn't want to. But yet what? Now what does he say? Right? I want to. We'll say literally he's doubled over in pain. Right? You've broken every bone in his body. I want to. And we'll say, by the way, you see from here the koach hadibor. The koach hadibor will say that sometimes the only way to move yourself forward in life is to make a verbal declaration of intent. I want to. Even though in my heart, I don't want to. In my soul, I don't want to. But sometimes the only way to move yourself forward is with a verbal declaration. I will say, by the way, this is why the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva, Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph, talks about the mitzvah of vidui. And what does Rambam say? Chayav lisvados. And how does vidui take place? Befiv. See, I will say, cognitive vidui, confessing something in your heart or in your head, is meaningless. The only time vidui is meaningful is if you actively articulate it with your words. Why? Because words create realities. And I will say sometimes the only path forward is to verbally articulate something. So in this case, even though the guy internally may not want to, the fact that he articulates, I want to, that is his true ratzon. So I will say it's interesting. Sometimes my true ratzon is what I have in my heart, and sometimes my true ratzon is what I say with my lips. And the truth is, sometimes in life, when you're at a stalemate, when you can't move yourself forward, the best way to move yourself forward is articulate what you want to do, who you want to be, where you want to go. Because if you say it enough, you'll get there. But if you don't say it, if you don't create a verbal reality for yourself, you'll just remain mired in your current circumstances. It's incredible. We'll say interesting case. Cholzin afapi she'ein makirin. So we'll say halacha l'maisa. We could do chalitza even if Beis Din doesn't recognize the people in question. Memanin afapi she'ein makirin. Similarly, we could do miyun even if we don't recognize the parties. Lefichach. En kosvin get chalitza, ella imkein makirin, then kosvin get miyun, ella imkein makirin, dechashinin lebeis din toen. So I will say, therefore, Allah chalamaysa, I will say, now we haven't spoken about this explicitly, but after a woman does chalitza, they would give her like a document, just a piece of paper that says, by the way, this woman did chalitza. That's kind of her license to get married with the general population. The Gemara says, you don't write that document unless, of course, what? That the witnesses or the Beis Din recognizes the people who are coming along and doing chalitza or miyun. Both the same would apply if you have a girl who is married off by her mother or her brother. So she is a minor who is married off into a rabbinic marriage. We only do miyun. We only write a document for miyun if we recognize the parties. But Rava Didei Rava himself said, "Ein cholzin ela imkin makirin." The boss is right. Boss said, "This is halacha l'maisa. Chalitza Beis Din will not do chalitza unless, of course, they know the parties." And I both say, knowing the parties could mean that halacha l'maisa, either again, the members of the Beis Din actually know them, or they receive eidos, attesting to the identity of these people, right? This is Rachel and this is Shimon. And Beis Din will not go ahead and do miyun unless, of course, we know the identities of the people involved. Lefichach, kosvin get chalitza, afapi she'in makirin. The kosvin get miyun. Therefore, I will say witnesses are allowed to go ahead and write up a document of chalitza or miyun, even if the witnesses themselves don't recognize the parties. Why? Because since Beis Din will only do a chalitza if the Beis Din recognizes the parties, or Beis Din will only do miyun if Beis Din recognizes the parties, therefore what? The witnesses are permitted to draft the document even if they don't recognize them. Because since the Beis Din recognizes them, that's enough. Because we'll say we're not concerned about Beis Din making a mistake. And we'll say that is indeed how we pass in halacha l'maisa, that in order for a Beis Din to do chalitza or miyun, the Beis Din must recognize the people, the parties involved. Whether Beis Din knows them on their own or what? Or halacha l'maisa, Beis Din has edus to go and ascertain about the identities. But Beis Din will not do a chalitza or a miyun if Beis Din does not know the people involved. But say Amud Beis, Mishnah. But say really fascinating Mishnah. Mitzvahs chalitza mitzvahs chalitza. We'll say, here we go. It's fascinating. This is the last Mishnah of the parak. What's the mitzvah of chalitza? What's the process? Here we go. Bahu v'yivim til Beis Din. We'll say it's fascinating. It's the last Mishnah. It's the Mishnah, the first Mishnah. Here we go. Bahu v'yivim til Beis Din. So we'll say here's the case. Rachel was married to Ruvain. Ruvain died without children. So now Rachel and Shimon, surviving brother, come to Beis Din. And I will say the first thing Beis Din does is Beis Din looks at the shidduch. Right? Beis Din looks at the shidduch, and Beis Din says to Shimon, "Good idea, not a good idea." Shene'emar v'karla ziknei imro v'dabru elav v'hiomeres. And I will say, so now what happens? Let's assume right now that this is a situation where we're going to do chalitza. Right. So the first step is they show up in Beis Din. Beis Din sizes up the shidduch. Good idea, not a good idea. Let's assume for a moment. Now we're talking about a case where there's going to be chalitza. Via meres, I will say, so now what's the process for chalitza? Via meres, I will say, remember again, she has a speaking part. What's her first speaking part? Mein yivami lahakim la'achav shem. So ultimately, I will say, the first speaking part over here is, she comes along and says, Mein yivami lahakim la'achav shem. My brother-in-law does not want to establish a name for his deceased brother. La'ava yivami, right? He does not want to marry me. V'hu omer, and now he says, Lo chafatzti lekachta. Yes, I do not want to marry her. So she speaks, my brother-in-law doesn't want to marry me. He says, I don't want to marry her. Ubelashna kodesh hayu omrim. And all of this took place in the psukim, in Lashna kodesh in Hebrew. So we'll say, then what happens? So ultimately, again, the Yevama comes in front of him, in front of the Beis Din. She removes the shoe from his foot. The yarka b'fanav, and she spits in his face. Now we're going to see spits in his face doesn't literally mean she spits in his face. It means she spits in front of him, right? So we'll say, here's the process. She says her line, my brother-in-law doesn't want to marry me. He says his line, I do not want to marry her. She goes over to him, right? Takes off his shoe, spits in front of him. And they both say, when it comes to the spitting, ro kanir l'dayanim, and it has to be, the spit has to be visible. As both say, so the actual saliva has to be visible in front of the dayanim. Va'ansa va'amra, and then she speaks again and she says, Kacha ye'aseh le'ish asher lo yivna es beis achiv. This is what's done to the man who does not want to build his brother's home. Ad kan hayunu makrim. So we'll say, you used to be that this was the end of chalitza. Done. Hatzlacha rabbit to everyone. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Horkanus tachas ha'ala b'kfar itam. Rabbi Horkanus, when he used to conduct chalitza underneath the oak tree in the village of Itam, the Gomer's kala parsha, he would say the rest of the parsha of chalitza as well. Huchsekuliyos Gomer's kala parsha. So we'll say this practice took kind of caught on, and they said the rest of the parsha of chalitza. The nikra shemo b'Yisrael beis chalutz hanal. And Rabbi said, then how does it end? They will call his name, talking about the brother-in-law, beis chalutz hanal, the house of the removed shoe. Mitzvah b'dayanim v'lo mitzvah b'tamidin. Rabbi said, who is supposed to say that? The dayanim say this phrase. V'nikra, this pasuk, v'nikra shemo b'Yisrael beis chalutz hanal. The dayanim would say this. His name in Klal Yisrael should be beis chalutz hanal. Rabbi said, it is a mitzvah on the dayanim to say that, not the talmidim. Rabbi said, b'pashtos by a chalitza, you would often have talmidim who were there as well. So the talmidim would not say, dayanim would say this. Rabbi Yehuda says, mitzvah akala omdim lomar chalutz hanal. Rabbi Yehuda would say, no, it was the mitzvah upon everyone assembled to say beis chalutz hanal. So we'll say, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, mitzvah's chalitza. Rabbi will say, what is the process for chalitza? Here it is. Kora, v'korei, v'choletzes, v'rokaka, v'kora, v'roka, v'kora. So we'll say, here's the order. What's the order? She says her line, my brother-in-law doesn't want to marry me. He says his line, I don't want to marry her. She removes the shoe, she spits, and then she says again, this is what is done ultimately to the man who will not go ahead and rebuild his home. That's the process. To which the Gemara says, my kamash malon. We'll say, well, what is Rav Yehuda coming to teach us? Masnisinhi, kamash, right? Masnisinhi. This is exactly what the Mishnah just said. It's just restating the Mishnah. So which the Gemara says, kamash malon, we'll say first wide line, mitzvahachi, that this is the ideal order. She speaks, he speaks, removal of the shoe, spitting, right? Spitting, and now one last recitation, right? Now both say again, whether the recitation, right, then her recitation of kacha yasel ish, to which the Gemara says v'apich lan, v'apich les lan ba. Now so we already learned this. What is the Gemara coming to teach me? That halacha l'maisa, if what? If you switch the order, it's okay. So we've already seen this. This is the ideal order, but if you mess up the order, it's not ma'akev. To which the Gemara says, that supports this. Whether you moved, whether you made the removal of the shoe before the spitting, so say, as much as the Mishnah is outlining the ideal process, she speaks, he speaks, removal of shoe, spit, she speaks, and then it appears that there's really one general statement at the end. That's the ideal order. If you mess up the order, the chalitza is still good. Amra Abaye, Haiman de Makri, get chalitza, lo likri lidida, lo lichudei va'avai v'mi lichudei. So this is very interesting. Sabai says, remember, I will say, as we've seen, the Beis Din feeds the lines to the man and to the woman. So we'll say, Abai is saying that when you feed the lines, you have to be careful to feed certain phrases intact. So for example, I will say, the first thing the woman says is, Me'ein yivami lahakim la'achiv. Right? Lo ava yabmi. My brother-in-law does not want. Now, Abaye says, don't make sure you feed her the phrase lo ava as one intact phrase. Don't say lo and then ava. Why? Because I will say, what could happen? So the Gemara says, demashma ava yivami. Because I will say, then what does it sound like? Lo is no. Ava means what? Wants to. If you feed that phrase independently, it sounds like the Yavam wants to marry the Yevama. So make sure to feed her the phrase lo ava as one phrase. Ella lo ava yivami. V'lo likrili didei lo lichudei chafatz lichudei. Similarly, again, when the Yavam is going to say lo chafatzti, don't feed him that phrase as lo and then chafatzti, because if he says the word chafatzti by itself, it sounds like what? He wants to marry her. Rather, the Gemara says, chafatzti lekachta. Ella lo chafatzti lekachta. Feed that to him as one phrase. I do not want to marry her. Rava Amar Rava says, Afsuki milsi, Afsuki milsi leslama. Rava says, don't worry about it. Everyone understands what's going on over here. Sometimes Rabbi say, depending on the person, you could only feed them so many words at once. But we understand in context, even if you break up between lo and ava, or lo and chafatzti, we understand what's happening over here. Chalitza. I want to be able to do chalitza. Why do they do chalitza? Because they don't want to do yibum. So because we understand what's happening over here, don't worry about the fact if there's a pause in the words. Incredible. Ravashi ashkechel Rav Kahana the kamit star umakrila lo ava yivami. So I will say Ravashi said that Rav Kahana was very makbid, and only to read her lo ava yivami. Amarle lo savarle mar lo hadu Rava. Didn't sure what Rava said. Rava said, don't worry about breaking up the words. It doesn't make a difference. Amarle mode Rava below ava yivami. Even Rava agrees, Rabbi say, in that first phrase that she says, Lo ava yivami, my brother-in-law does not want to marry me, that phrase has to be intact. Even though Rava says other phrases you could be makel on, that first phrase, which is really the phrase that begins chalitza, at the end of the day, even Rava agrees that phrase has to be intact. Amr Abaye, Haiman de Kasev Gita de la Chalitzasa, Lichtov Hachi. So what's an interesting case now? See, Rabbi say, they're calling this now what they call the Gita de Chalitzasa. What this really means is like this. It appears that Beis Din would often have like a piece of parchment, right, with the parsha of Chalitza on it. So they would have that. Because remember again, Beis Din, most people coming into Beis Din for Chalitza, Rabosai, do not know their lines by heart, right? So what does Beis Din have to do? They have to feed them the line. Now Beis Din should have the text in front of them. Where do they have the text from? So you could open up a Sefer Torah, but that'd be a little bit, tedious. So we'll say, so they would have the Parsha of Chalitza written on a piece of parchment. Right, written on a piece of parchment. So we'll say, now we're going to get into the halachos concerning that piece. So Modi Rava, so the Gemara Arma Abai Hayman the Kasim Gita the Chalitzasa Lichtov Hachi. We'll see, that we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up, Mirat Hashem was trying to finish the parak, but we'll finish the parak in Mirat Hashem tomorrow. We'll say again, Mirat Hashem, beautiful, beautiful Gemara ahead of us the next few days. Shkoyach, a little bit of an advanced mazel tov, but we'll get there tomorrow. Shkoyach.